Tech Podcast. We are at episode 493. Very pleased to have with me on the show Philip Whitmore, back again. He's partner at KPMG Cyber. Welcome along, Philip.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me back.
Hey, great. Always great to hang out and get to catch up on what's happening in the world of technology. Now, before we jump into all the news and topics, and we're going to talk about cybersecurity, we're going to talk about Tesla taking on Toyota and the rest of the auto industry, what's Google doing to show some respect for the New Zealand market, what are cyber criminals doing to show a complete lack of respect for New Zealand and New Zealand businesses. A special thank you to our show partners that keep us on the air, if that's a legit way of describing what we do these days. And so, yeah, huge thank you to Gorilla Technology, Samsung, HP, Vocus, Spark, Vodafone, and Sumo Logic. So thanks to those companies for standing behind the technology sector here in New Zealand, and especially the New Zealand Tech Podcast. So, Philip, before we jump into hearing all your thoughts and opinions on cybersecurity matters, which is what you live and breathe day to day, we a few other topics that I wanted to talk about. And first up is Tesla. Last week, having hit the top spot on the share market, their market cap making them worth more than Toyota. And when I looked at the numbers again this morning, I was doing an interview on TV3 on this subject. It looked as though they were potentially back in that position again. And these companies tend to move up and down a little bit. But to me, it's just mind blowing that this fairly small car company, in many regards, it was only March that they got to the point of being able to celebrate having sold 1 million vehicles. So, in the scheme of how many cars there are in the world and that are sold globally, they're a bit player right now. Yet, investors think that they very much are the future, or there are a certain segment of investors that do. And so, I've been giving this a little bit of thought. Why has this happened? Is any of it justified? I'm curious about your thoughts before I share mine.
Look, it's interesting. It is interesting. And often, particularly for technology companies, that value is based upon the future.
Very much so, yes.
Where is it going? What can we see it doing? And look, having got a car last year, it all seemed very boring to me. All the cars seem roughly the same, all the same sort of features. And, but if I've got a Tesla, that's something a bit different. It's not a Porsche, it's not a Ferrari, but it's different and it's nice. And there's a brand perception with it, and there's some substance behind it now. And again, a lot of technology companies have not always had that substance. There has been no money coming through the door.
Yeah.
So I can understand why people see something in it. There's something different. It's an American manufacturing for cars, and a lot of cars these days aren't owned by the countries that we think they are. Things have gone around. Yeah. There's only probably, I would say, and I might be wrong here, about 10 car companies in the world, and all their subsidiaries that they own.
That's right.
So Tesla's a bit different. It's independent. A guy had an idea and he made it happen. He's got some interesting ideas at times, but is there? And Teslas are coming out now that are more affordable for people, and that's only going to improve over time. So I can understand that. Is it worth more than Toyota? I don't know about that.
That was interesting. We discussed that a little bit with Duncan Garner this morning, and of course in TV you've got to just race through things. You get about 2 words and then onto the next bit. But I made the comment that I think there's something that Tesla are doing that all businesses need to be doing. And look, Tesla could have easily just been an electric car company, but arguably they're more of a technology company than they are a car company now. And I say arguably because I'm sure there are different views on that, but the technology piece, when you combine that, is the bit that I think that really gives them the edge and gives them the step up on the other players. And look, the technology part of that is in that they're an electric vehicle and they've got this great range. And it's just in the last 24 hours, I think, that they've put up a blog post that they're, they've got at the moment 4 vehicles for sale, but the Model S, which was really their original vehicle for not quite mass market, but that wasn't just very, very super niche, because their Roadster was their very first vehicle. That's kept improving over the years since it was released in the direction of 8 years ago, and they just announced that they've hit a range of 400 miles, which comes out to about 640 kilometres. Now, this is based on the EPA range in the US, and there are varying ones. The range that gets used in New Zealand is bizarre because it's generally kind of way out. But so they've had this increase in range that's pretty impressive. I think even compared to what their vehicles were getting last year, it's like 10% up or something like that. I think their press release or their blog post mentioned 20% increase, but it wasn't a like-for-like comparison. It was their performance model versus their long range. So I'm not sure what the exact number is there, but a growing range. They announced via, I guess this was an internal communication to their staff, that they're at the point now where they can begin production of their trucks, like their full-size semi-trucks. And they're continuing to update the software. So on Friday, myself and a bunch of others who got sucked into buying this piece of technology on wheels were excited to see that there was a software update coming through. And when that arrived on our vehicles, we found that they had turned on a capability to do with how the Teslas, when used in New Zealand, Australia or Canada, now deal with stop signs, traffic lights, T-junctions, roundabouts, a few other things, but those 4 main things. And what it does is, if you're allowing the car to, I guess, be on a cruise control type mode, which most vehicles are, I'm guessing you would tend to use cruise control more on a longer vehicle, on a longer journey, from my own experience. The Tesla, you can turn on that adaptive cruise control and the autopilot on just about any street which has got clearly marked lines on the left and right of where you're driving. But of course, if you were to fall asleep at the wheel or be inattentive and you're coming into traffic lights or to a stop sign, look, with typical cruise control, it's just going to drive straight through, right? So this capability now, in those cases, it will slowly grind to a halt unless you give it confirmation that, hey, it's okay to keep driving. So it's not at a point yet where it takes into consideration whether traffic lights are green or red, whether there's anything coming when you get to a roundabout, which you need to actually control your vehicle through a roundabout anyway. It's not quite there on that tech. And a stop sign, well, I think legally in New Zealand, as in probably everywhere in the world, if it says stop, you are actually supposed to come to a stop, but it allows you to ignore that if you wish to. So it's interesting just to see these continual adjustments and moving forward of what's possible. Of course, I will recommend to anybody who's driving a Tesla, whether you're an owner or just somebody trying it out, do keep your hands on the wheel, a foot near the brake if you're letting it do its own thing, because they're not flawless yet, but pretty impressive for I guess a car that isn't I guess got the same sort of level of technology in it as Waymo, for instance, with their very expensive LiDAR technology and so on, and the fact that most of this technology works in lots and lots of places. It's not limited to a particular mapped location.
The update feature is interesting, because I'm used to a car, when it has an update, I might get a new map on my GPS. I might get something else fixed where it runs a bit smoother. And that's about I set up for a car last year, and it's a fairly modern car, and that's about its update capability. But I can, turn on a whole bunch of new features and do a whole bunch of new things. I've got a computer with some wheels on it.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. The possibility. It's a bit like we sit there with our phones or, iOS 11, 12, whatever, 13's going to come out. What's it going to give me? What's it going to do? There's this, I guess, expectation, the perception that something new and exciting is coming, and that drives some value.
I think it does, and I think that's part of where Tesla's share price has risen, because owners who have experienced it and realise there is a sort of night and day difference in terms of how the Tesla works from that software perspective, that would remind them, if they're, for instance, an iPhone owner, of the disruption that Apple and ultimately Google caused to the smartphone, mobile phone market. And this idea that a vehicle can get better and better over time, and I mean there are so many. We'd be sitting here for a long time chatting through, even just in the whatever it is, however many months I've had it, maybe eight months. All of the things that have come through in terms of software, if we delved in and chatted about exactly, how they work and what they do. So there is an element of it being somewhat game changing. But the comment I made to Duncan this morning was, well, it's very much in the hands of Toyota and these other players. They still dominate the market largely. If they can reorientate their businesses and get themselves into a position where they operate on, what I'd say where Tesla is, which is a very modern, agile company, continuous improvement to their vehicles through software updates and so on, and even small things. We heard last week that the Tesla Model 3, which I've got it's got 2 USB ports for passengers sitting in the back, and there's an option for a wireless charger up front, which I have. They've just changed it sort of mid-cycle, not waiting for the 2021 model or anything. They've just changed those ports to be USB-C because that's what they think is the right thing to be doing now. And so they'll make those sort of changes midstream in the same way they just did with the Model S. It now has this longer range for ones that are ordered from now going forward. That's not something that lines up with a particular year. So very different to the traditional automakers, and it puts them in a great position. But any other company could probably achieve very similar things. But right now there is still a disconnect between the old ways of operating and this approach that Tesla are taking.
And it is that concept. I mean, you look at you see the iPhone and Android coming from Google. It wasn't really the hardware, because Nokia did some fantastic hardware and BlackBerry did some great hardware. It was software and how that's the user experience and how things are delivered to users and apps, that's what made the change. And obviously now the older hardware is gone and we see that competition. It could be the same thing with the car.
So, whether the investors are right or wrong, we will see. But it's often talked about in the Facebook groups and amongst Tesla owners online, where people are debating, should I pay the extra for what is called full self-drive, which of course there's no such thing really at the moment, but you're paying for this feature that may be delivered at some point in time, and the price of it gradually is going up. And a lot of people say, look, if you've got enough money to afford it, just buy some Tesla shares, and then in a few months they will have gone up enough that you can put that money back in your pocket if you wish, and then take the increase from the shares having moved up and pay for it that way. Now, I don't know. The share price could be half what it is now. In another 6 months, those things are, that's crystal ball gazing stuff. But interesting. Now on to this sort of discussion we've had over a few months, I suppose, is Microsoft Teams has kind of got this media attention in recent months that it didn't really have any sort of mainstream media attention, and even Zoom to a degree. I've heard from people say I'd never heard of Zoom before COVID, but now I'm using Zoom, and this is this new verb and so on, and yeah. So I guess the latest news this week was that Teams is addressing one of its shortcomings with Zoom, because I think a lot of organisations have already, they've either ditched Zoom, they never had Zoom, they're just going with Teams for video calling. Others have been not pleased with Teams because it doesn't maybe have quite the parity with Zoom on some features, and one of those was how many callers you could put on the screen at once. Teams, it was 4, that's bumped to 9. Zoom has allowed you to have 49 people's faces on the screen. Microsoft have announced that they will be offering that starting this month for some users. They've sort of preview version and then rolling out more broadly in the next few months. So just interesting to see that Microsoft are really upping their pace in terms of delivery of new capabilities, and they're working so hard to make sure that they can really compete. And last week, of course, the discussion was Teams versus Slack, and Slack's partnership with Amazon and Amazon Chime. So yes, Microsoft are working very, very hard on that front. Now, where are you on Teams? Do you use Teams or Zoom the most?
So certainly for work, we're using Teams. A lot of excuse me, a lot of the Microsoft suite, and it works well. I think number one thing over lockdown was the ability to do custom backgrounds.
Yes, well, Zoom very popular for that, because I think they started early on to offer, if you had a green screen, you could do a custom background, and then they moved to there being a bit of smart, so it could do it, so anyone could do a custom background, and you could do custom video backgrounds in Zoom as well, right?
You can. Look, I find Teams a bit better in terms of lower processing power. If your graphics card will make it a better outcome, but it does it well. I mean, Teams is rolling out new features monthly, if not, bi-monthly. And I think, the cloud nature of that just makes it possible. Teams works well, integrates with everything else. From the corporate version, I found it great. People got used to it. I mean, Zoom's great as well. I mean, there was a lot of criticism initially for some security shortcomings or some perception shortcomings. Like a lot of that was around users not understanding how to use these types of applications, whether it's Teams or Zoom or something else. And and Zoom did fix the underlying technology issues pretty quick, and good on them too. It wasn't an app we'd used previously. It was more something we'd use at home in a personal life rather than a commercial app. So they've done really well. And it's like any sort of software. The most popular stuff will get focused on by the hackers because that's the biggest return on investment.
Yeah.
And the volume of people using it's huge. But it's great to see that Teams keep changing. I mean, Teams is going to replace Skype for Business. I now just need one app.
And maybe at some point, longer term, even replacing the Skype consumer product possibly.
Correct.
Because they're making it available to the general public, and we see Zoom has become very, very popular with the general public. Now, one thing that I see is fascinating here, when for those who follow all of the companies with their different products, it's been interesting in recent years how Microsoft have generally found it pretty hard to gain traction on a lot of their products from any sort of consumer awareness perspective, right? When you had Microsoft Cortana, and you had Siri, your Google Assistant. I mean, Cortana would get zero press. Didn't help them. They didn't make it available, broadly internationally, and varying other things where just the Microsoft product wouldn't ever get a mention, regardless of whether it was any good or not. And I guess part of that is most journalists are technology consumers. They don't sort of sit inside a large organisation and using sort of business-oriented products. So there's that aspect. Whereas Microsoft have very much become a maker of software predominantly for businesses, whether they're small or whether they're large. And of course, Google had a huge amount of success with G Suite. That would probably fit into the category where a lot of journalists would be using those products. Hangouts, for instance, would be probably the video, one of the video products that would get a fair bit of mention. Skype sort of been sitting away in the background there, but Hangouts was a discussion. You'd hear much more talk about Hangouts and references to it than you would about Skype for Business, for instance, and traditional media. But Microsoft have pushed very hard with Teams, and they're getting talked about in mainstream media. COVID-19 and people working from home has been part of that, but I'm very curious what Microsoft has learned from this and how it might flavour how they do things in the future. I mean, it's fair to say they've pushed incredibly hard with Teams. They've invested in it. They've forced its rollout on organisations that aren't looking and controlling what Microsoft pushes out. So it potentially upset some people there, but it's created this mass awareness, and they've had overall pretty impressive adoption.
And I think you're going to see some interesting changes, certainly from a business point of view over the next few months of Microsoft. They're rolling out whole ecosystems of products, whereas previously I bought that from Microsoft. I might have bought my antivirus from somewhere else, this from something else. Well, now Microsoft just does it all, and as part of your licensing with its Office 365 or Azure, you've already paid for it. You've already got it. So why have multiple products that don't necessarily talk to each other that well when Microsoft's doing most of it and taking over the ecosystem? And it does it well. So that will be interesting. I think some of the legacy vendors out there, say from a security suite where I'm closely involved with, will start to have a hard time because Microsoft's bringing out features that already do that, or software that already does that. The whole Teams thing's interesting. The first IRC server, back in the early 90s, I was using it.
Or tell people what IRC is if
Internet relay chat.
Sure.
Think Teams without video. Hasn't changed that much. Slack is very much like the old IRC.
It's true.
It was a need for it. What was the need for it? And COVID-19 drove a need in our personal lives and in our corporate lives. And I think sometimes we're not creative enough. It's like Microsoft things, Hello, which, biometric sign into our laptops and that works really well. Do people have it turned on? Generally, no. Sometimes linking up that business need or that personal need to technology has been hard. I think Microsoft's done that well. How can we use these tools to make our lives easier?
Yeah, well, full credit to them. They're doing well on this front anyway. Now, Google, their Google Assistant, this is probably a little bit of a surprise to many, because you've had the Google Home Mini available in retailers in New Zealand for some time. So having a physical Google Assistant device just seems like a reasonably normal thing. A lot of Kiwis have them. Actually, what I had not clicked onto, I guess, because we have so many Android phones in New Zealand, and Google Assistant on their phones is very common, was actually Google had never actually launched their what is now called the Nest Mini. They'd never actually launched that in New Zealand. So last week I had a call with them, and I've been testing out their Nest Mini, which launches here in I think it's 25th of June. And with that, I suppose we actually will, and I'm waiting for a little bit more information through from Google, because if you set up the Nest Mini locally right now, I guess it is pre-launch, then it doesn't quite know what language to give you. I set it up from the iPhone, and using the Google Home app, and it had a look and said, well, you're set to English New Zealand. I don't have a match, and it was offering me some non-English language to sort of set it up for was the default. So I scrolled down and choose English Australian, which is fine. But there are some shortcomings when these things aren't fully supported, and I guess I noticed those with Amazon Alexa, the Amazon Echo devices, using those for a few years prior to their local launch. It wasn't until they were launched locally they really became really good and capable, because there were these shortcomings with language and other aspects that just weren't quite right. So really pleasing to see that Google treating New Zealand as a sort of full class citizen of this planet now. And we've had some discussions in the past on the New Zealand Tech podcast around, hey, why aren't Google releasing certain products locally in New Zealand officially, and you had people basically having to get a parallel import version. And look, you can understand there's a level, they're a business, they want these transactions to be profitable, and for every new market that they launch them in, there is some sort of cost of providing that support. But also, look, they're a really big global company, and to be fair, we've had these complaints around Microsoft in the past. They never launched Cortana sort of officially in New Zealand, their consumer product. Even Apple, when they went from products that were launching in New Zealand first in the world because of our time zone, to maybe one or two occasions where suddenly they were launching them in other markets but not New Zealand. Usually they're pretty well lined up on those things these days. So look, I just think it's encouraging. It's great to see that Google are doing that. On the call was Google's New Zealand country manager. And I hope we'll have further engagements with Google on the podcast in the future. But to me, that was just a sign that they were taking that time to engage locally, that they're launching the Nest Mini locally, and no doubt other things are going on, and they've got a growing team in New Zealand. I think they're about 50 people at the moment. So things are very much on the move from a Google perspective.
Yeah, look, I was like many people. I hadn't realised I'd had them since 2017. I probably picked them up in Australia now. In hindsight, I had a Google Home from probably 2016, the US. I just assumed they were here.
Yes,
Had to do some funny things back in the days, setting my time zone to Guam to make things work in the Pacific and bits and pieces. That was pre-Australian launch. But no, so I guess they've got a brand perception out there already without having done anything, which is maybe a smart move.
Yeah. Now I do want to on an episode soon dive a little bit more into a somewhat well, it's another one of the big companies, Apple, with their Apple Watch Series 5 LTE that I've been doing some experimentation with over the last little while, and so we'll delve into that a little bit more, but I'll share the challenge that I had. I have numbers on Spark, Vodafone, and now on 2 Degrees, so I can test different devices, test the networks and so on. But my primary number has been with Vodafone for a fair chunk of time. And I, when Spark announced that they were going to be supporting the Apple Watch with an eSIM and concurrent calling, I made the comment to, amongst others, the CEO at Vodafone locally, that I'll be porting my number from Vodafone, my primary number from Vodafone to Spark. We're gonna flip that around. I realised I had a little bit of a challenge in that I'm using an old, now no longer sold service, but Vodafone are continuing to provide it for me, that I was going to lose if I moved out and came back again. So next week I will share how I now have my Vodafone number ringing on my Apple Watch quite successfully when I'm at a little bit of a distance and so on. There's not rocket science there, but it was nice to figure that out, but I didn't have to port my number to do it. Now, a couple more things that we wanted to delve into really down the cybersecurity track while you're here, Philip. First up, Cryptopia. Now, there's their story. There are cryptocurrency trading firm. I guess would be the sort of terminology I would refer to them as, out of Christchurch. Their systems were compromised, and it turned out the way that they were storing people's cryptocurrencies, their Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on, maybe wasn't quite the safest approach, and it's not unique to them entirely, I suppose, their approach. But effectively, a lot of people have lost money, and the company hit the wall, and then has been the receivers have been working through the processes of trying to work out what they can give out to people. It looks fairly complex. What were the sort of highlights from your perspective, having read a little bit of the report that just came out in the last few days?
Look, it's been interesting because the liquidated receivers have had a challenge, even just things from digital assets. Who owns these digital assets they have there? Is it the people who have put the money in? So like you and I had a bank account, or is it the company themselves? So back in February they went to court to get a ruling on that because there's no clear law in New Zealand, and that said, well, the cryptocurrencies are owned by the account holders, like you and I own our money in our bank accounts. So that's good, because they certainly had creditors challenging that. Creditors own money and saying, hey, here's all these millions of dollars worth of money sitting there, that stuff that wasn't stolen. Can we have some of it, please, because we're owed money. So I guess that's been a positive. The challenge now,
depending on where you sit with it's a positive.
True. For the account holders.
Yeah.
The challenge
absolutely.
now is, unlike often with cryptocurrency, there isn't individual wallets. It's one big wallet or a series of wallets with multiple people having a partial ownership in that. So how do you identify who those people are, and have they complied with the anti-money laundering laws to get that sort of positive confirmation? And I think that's difficult. The answer may be not fully.
That looks really complex in terms of complying with the AML, anti-money laundering rules. And because there were so many account holders, over 1 million, very, very hard to actually work through that, because it costs a lot of money in terms of time and effort to actually jump through those hoops.
To prove ownership, it's going to be hard. I mean, the receivers are going to have a challenging time because people want their money back. I don't know. That'd be interesting to watch and see
how good and trustworthy is the database that says who owns what, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, that database didn't match up to the money, essentially. There was not a reconciliation between them. So can you say, well, would I argue, well, actually, it wasn't my assets that were stolen, it was someone else's cryptocurrency. I should have all mine back, please. That will be an interesting challenge as well, or do you divvy it up?
Yeah. Wow. And also on a local New Zealand front, we've had what is really, crazy in terms of the scale of it, is the ransomware hits that we've had in New Zealand this year. Now, it's not just New Zealand. These things are happening around the world. But in the past, there have been very few ransomware cases that have hit the public media as far as New Zealand's concerned. Now, Toll Group, twice that they've been hit, and a huge impact when an organisation of scale, and quite often a huge impact if it's a smaller organisation, gets hit with ransomware. So, first of all, it was Toll. Then in the last week or so, we heard about Fisher and Paykel Appliances and Lion, which we would have previously referred to as Lion Breweries, I suppose. And then, continuing hearing all the international cases. I think in the same period we heard about Honda that had got hit. These things are having mass disruption, and there are a couple of aspects that are quite different in terms of what we were looking at when we were seeing ransomware maybe a year ago. Do you want to walk us through what you've seen in regards to ransomware and how much worse of a problem you think it is now than it was a year ago?
Sure. Look, New Zealand is one of the most targeted countries in the world for ransomware because we are
gullible.
trusting, gullible, naive. Let's go with trusting.
Sad,
Trusting's a good word. And that's a great part of our culture.
Yeah, it is.
We are not good at cybersecurity. We tend to think we're great. We're not even probably good. Yeah, some places are okay. And it is that trusting nature and a lack of regulation. So, ransomware has been significant here, but it's been $500 demand. It's been a $2,000 demand. The impact hasn't been that high. People have often paid it out. People restore from backups, and it hasn't impacted operations, particularly in sort of a manufacturing type environment or a logistical environment where it's had a real impact not only on that company but all their customers. So we're starting to see the impact of ransomware being far more significant on you and me as individuals and other companies, and obviously the people that get impacted. We're also starting to see the amount that's being demanded going up significantly. As I said, it used to be $500, a couple $1,000. We're seeing six-figure sums somewhat often now in New Zealand. And also you've seen some of the ones in the media lately where they're saying, if you don't pay us, not only will we not get your information back, but we're going to share it with the public or share it with others. So the threat of disclosure of potentially sensitive information.
That's huge, isn't it? Because you could have been, last year if you'd been hit and you'd just recovered your backup, whatever your scenario was to get back on your feet, you wouldn't have considered really paying anything if you could get back up and running very quickly. But now you might be all back up and running and fully operational, but you are potentially going to give in to that ransom because you don't want your data to get leaked. And that is a really, really horrible scenario. And the back of my mind would be, if you were in that position and you pay out, what's to stop them coming back again in 6 months because they've had a payment out of you now? Will they try again at some point in the future, right?
And the answer is maybe. In the past, generally it hasn't. But you're right, that's evolving. You're right. If you can make a good return on your time as a criminal, why wouldn't you go back? It's interesting. Look, there are some simple things that can do. CertNZ, which is a government agency set up to educate New Zealanders and deal with incidents, put out some basic guidance on top 10 things you can do. They would go a long way, just those by themselves, to reduce the likelihood of ransomware and certainly reduce the impact. It would be nice to see us taking it a little bit more seriously, because it's not a nice thing to do to go in once it's hit an organisation. It really impacts the people.
And so who are the sort of organisations that you and your team end up dealing with and hearing from and helping out basically with these sorts of things?
Oh, look! It's everyone and anyone. Schools, law firms, architect firms, accounting firms, manufacturing organisations, financial institutions, you name it. Ransomware is common. You just don't see it on the 6 o'clock news so often. But you see more and more articles about organisations that, is part of our day-to-day life. Hopefully that's a bit of a wake-up call.
I hope so. I mean, with Gorilla, our team are regularly involved in doing technology audits of New Zealand organisations, usually at the smaller to medium end. And I've got to say, in most cases, I'm just shocked and disappointed at the level in which the organisation is protected from a cybersecurity perspective, and just how at risk they are to ransomware and phishing attacks, and so many other things where they could be much further down the track on those things.
People are making assumptions that they've got antivirus software that's going to stop ransomware. It might sometimes, but many times it won't.
Agreed. Yeah. Now, what else is happening? You were mentioning to me before we started that you've got a little competition going on.
Yeah. So we got a bit bored a couple of weeks ago. So what we got kicking off this Friday is a cybersecurity competition open to everyone in the IT industry in New Zealand and any tertiary students studying cybersecurity. And it's a bit of fun. And it's designed for people that are very new to the area, so not a lot of knowledge, and also through to very, very experienced people. There's enough to keep people challenged. So let's just go along, have a look at www.kpmg kpmgcyberchallenge.co.nz. It'd be great to see people involved. There's a few hundred people involved at the moment. We'd love to see more. Some nice prizes up as well, from 3D printer to a 37-inch widescreen curved gaming monitor. We'd love to keep them, but equally we probably should give them away.
Oh, very nice. That's very cool. Excellent. Well, thanks, Philip. It's been great to catch up. Great to have you on the show again. And look, special thanks, of course, to our show partners as well. Their support of the show is very much appreciated. And, of course, to you that are listening in. We appreciate your support each episode. And we will be back again with a new episode next week. But I should mention a couple of new podcasts that are worth looking out for. If you or somebody you know has an interest in the food sector, we have a new show called the Kiwi Foodcast, which has got some quite fascinating stories starting to come together. The first episode is out now, and probably by the time some of you hear this, the second episode will be out as well. So yeah, great sort of inside stories, I guess. It's probably the crossover between food and business, so a lot about the stories behind food businesses. And then the other one we've got is a focus on remote working, which is quite relevant at the moment, but of course has been relevant for a very long time. A lot of people have run businesses from home and operated remotely. So that one is up on the first show I mentioned, the Kiwi Foodcast, is on podcasts.nz. The remote work productivity and lifestyle is the other podcast, and you can find that at worldpodcasts.com. So yeah, a couple of new shows to sink your teeth into. Well, that's us. Thanks, everyone. We'll catch you again next week for the next episode of the New Zealand Tech Podcast. Okay, see ya.